we're going to start out this week talking about the difference between vector art and raster art. This is actually going to be a lecture on poster design, but this is important because a poster might be printed large. And so when you're printing something large, you really have to think about that resolution. So I wanted to talk about the resolution, and then we'll kind of look into more specific details about poster design. So to start out, I know you guys have heard me talk about this before, but there are two types of graphics that we use as graphic designers: vector art and raster art. So vector art is the kind of art we create in Adobe Illustrator, and those are the mathematically defined points and lines that are easy to scale, so they don't have to depend on resolution. You can make those graphics you create in Illustrator either large or small, and you don't even have to think about resolution, although the file sizes with Illustrator documents can get quite large depending on what you're creating. Then kind of jumping to raster art or bitmap graphics, those are created in Photoshop, and those have to do with pixels. And pixels are these tiny dots of information, and the total amount of pixels determine the resolution of an image. And there's specific file formats you use when you are creating and saving vector art and raster art. So for example, if you're creating a document in Illustrator and you want to preserve the scalability, you would save that file as either the Illustrative native file format, or as you could also save it as a PDF file, which supports vector, but you wouldn't want to save it, for example, as a JPEG, because once you save that vector art as a JPEG, it becomes pixelated and rasterized and then becomes a bitmap graphic. So file formats you use with raster art are JPEGs, GIFs, PNGs. So vector art, it's beautiful, it's scalable. Usually vector art is best suited for more flat color illustrations. If you start to get really complicated with your illustrations where it almost looks like a photorealistic drawing, then the file size can be enormous. But if you're creating a logo or you're creating a graphic that's more flat color, it's perfect. And then you can scale it, like I said, as large as you want. Bitmap, on the other hand, in Photoshop, these tiny dots of color are these pixels. And the pixels are all kind of crammed together in these little squares, and they form the image. And we know from doing our color theory that the dots of color with the resolution of the monitor are red, green, and blue. So we have these red, green, and blue dots of color, and they're put together in different quantities. So if you have more red dots compared to blue dots, then that's going to be a different color than if you have more blue dots compared to red dots. So we kind of learned that during our color theory class, but there are these little dots of information. And resolution is tied to how many dots per inch. So the term DPI is literally dots per inch. And here's just a little graphic to explain it. So if you had an image that was 5 pixels per inch or 5 dots per inch, this is what it would look like. So you can see that there's 5 down, 5 across, and it's 1 square inch with these 5 squares going across it. And so that's literally how they measure the resolution of an image. So why does it matter why we have to have really high resolution when we print posters? Because if we don't, it'll look kind of like this. It'll look interpolated. It won't look very good once we print it out. So the tricky part is resolution is different for the screen than it is for the print. If you print something, you need higher resolution. 300 DPI is kind of the standard, whereas if you're just showing something on the screen, you only need it to be around 72 DPI for it to look great. So that's where it gets a little tricky. So when you are doing a poster design, you have to think about how big that poster is going to be and really make sure that you have the proper resolution, especially if you're using images or creating a bitmap graphic. So this is kind of what that dialog box looks like in Photoshop. And you can see that up here is the file size. So this document would be 7.32 megabytes, and megabyte is equal to about 1,000 kilobytes. And you can see the document size here. So this would be a pretty big size poster, almost 20 inches by 20 inches. But the problem is the resolution's only 72. So if I were to print this out at 20 inches by 20 inches, it would look interpolated and it wouldn't look really good, very good. So this number, this resolution number, has to be at 300 by whatever inches you're going to be printing out the document for it to be optimal resolution. If you look up here, you see you have these two width and height numbers. These are kind of referring to the total pixels in the document. So a lot of time web designers or people who are designing for the screen want to have this pixel ratio because that could be important in terms of the size of their website and how it appears on the monitor. So kind of getting used to these interfaces that show you the specific size of the image you're using in Photoshop is important because you really want to understand these numbers as a designer. So then looking at this is pretty complicated, but you can see these numbers here. So web designers sometimes go by these numbers: 640 by 480, 800 by 600, 1024 by 768. Or if you're shooting with a digital camera, you might see these numbers, and these refer to the size of the image. File size has to do with how big that total image is once you save it. And then here's kind of the pixels per inch, or the equivalent of pixels per inch. And this would be the file size over here. So you can see that this is a very small file, 210 kilobyte, and this is becoming pretty large. 3.0 megabytes is a pretty large file, but that's not large for a big, beautiful print that you might print on a digital printer, for example. This is actually just kind of par for the course. So sometimes big digital posters will be, they could be hundreds of megabytes depending on what's in the image and the quality of the image. So really get that resolution stuff down and understand it. If you have questions, you can come to the Friday in-person lab hour. I'm happy to kind of work with you and help you out. It's also important when we scan that we understand resolution, but it's something that will be on our final quiz. So understand these numbers, what file size is, what resolution for print is, what, or at least optimal resolution for print, what optimal resolution for the web is, or the screen. Those are important things to understand. And also what types of files you need to save. So what would be a file type you would use when saving a file in Illustrator, and what would be a file type you would use saving a file in Photoshop for the web as opposed to saving a file for print. So all things to think about. So now let's just talk a little bit more about color. Because we are dealing with color in our posters, we really want to think about color. And I know we've talked about this already, but color really adds variety and mood to a design. You know that. And just as a typeface speaks to us, color communicates to us as well. Color has symbolic associations, and it has immense impact on the mood of your designs and the way people respond to it. And we've kind of talked about color symbolism, but white, for example, can be a pure color in Western cultures. We see it as symbolizing innocence, sterility, whereas red can be a more violent color. It can also symbolize danger and love. It can symbolize crime. So understand these symbolic meanings of color. And I think in our last week, we had a whole diagram that I posted in the weekly lesson that talked about some of this. So it's just getting these associations. As a designer, you want to research what the colors mean. And as you design for a global audience, you really want to understand those meanings and how colors affect certain cultures, because that does vary, and it can vary really dramatically between cultures. So just understanding that can really help you as a designer in choosing the color that's the most effective color for your particular audience. Color and mood. So we know that colors close to each other on the color wheel are more harmonious, whereas colors that are across each other on the color wheel create more tension and contrast. So looking at a couple of this is a poster design. This is this color palette, or these two colors together, are creating contrast. They're creating intensity. It's very bold, and it's making us look. So a lot of time with poster design, that can be really effective because you want the audience to really look and be captivated by what you're trying to communicate with the poster. This is kind of good strategy. So I know this is a little bit hard to see, but this is really dark text over here, and it says photographer, and it's the name of the photographer. And so it's kind of this beautiful blue image, this really kind of cooler image over here. And then in contrast, they put the yellow color on the other side. And that kind of harmonizes with the darker figures. And the small black text kind of pulls these two sides together because it's kind of matching the darkness of these robes. This is a great example of a design that's really using both a photograph and some illustration elements. And you're going to do that a lot in poster design, where you might start out in Photoshop. And for example, this is an image, a black and white image that was probably brought into Photoshop, and then they basically resaturated it with a color, yellow, and then they pulled it and put it into Illustrator, and then they added the graphic. And it's, what they're trying to communicate here is really the feeling of the music. The red is kind of signifying the Latin aspect of it. And it also is creating balance. So you have red here, it's kind of balancing out that space. And these lines are creating this energy that kind of pull the eye. So we know that certain colors recede and certain colors advance. So warm colors are going to kind of pop out at you, come towards you, and cool colors are going to kind of move away from you. So warm being red-orange and cool being blue-green. And for this really, really tense, vibrant scheme, use those complementary colors, which are across from each other. So some colors advance and some colors recede. We know that the same color can advance or recede depending on what color it is placed with. So that's something that you really need to think about. Place these colors next to each other and think about how they're interacting. What are they doing to each other? Hans Hofmann he was considered a colorist, and he's a fine artist this is a painting he did, oil on canvas. And what he does brilliantly is kind of creates this real effect of some of the shapes feel like they're kind of popping out at us. Other shapes feel like they're kind of receding into the space. So you see here, this is kind of clever. Now this photograph, this is a photograph, I believe. It was probably desaturated and then recolorized, kind of tinted in Photoshop. And so there would be certain elements that they placed color into, or they resaturated with a specific color. And they're using a really simple color scheme because they're using this hue, this kind of orange hue, and then they're using gray, really. And they're balancing it out. They're putting the orange inside of the text here with this inside word, and then it's also inside the photograph. So to keep kind of a harmonious color scheme, if you're using photographs, a really good idea is sometimes to use those colors that are actually in the photo with the text, so you get the exact color match. And you can use your eyedropper tool in Illustrator or Photoshop to just kind of grab that color and then apply it to that text. And this is also really nicely done because you see how the text is working together. They have this word inside with smaller lowercase font, and then they have Havana kind of popping out at us with this white. Okay, so legibility. When using type and color, legibility can come from contrast. The greatest legibility is black on white, and the least is yellow on white. And we saw that with some of our logo designs, where sometimes if you're putting logo, it kind of disappears if you put it on a white background, and often your logo does go on a white background. So you have to be careful about that. You have to kind of, especially if you're using a color like yellow, really test it and make sure that it's going to pop out on all shades of white that you're going to be using it with. And you see as the background color kind of moves closer to the text, the legibility decreases. A really kind of effective way of working is you can use percentages of a color that are close to create kind of a nice background texture effect. So to really kind of subtly put text on top of color or text on top of image, you can create a percentage that's maybe like 50, 60, 70%, and then put some text on top of that might be 100% and create this kind of layering effect. So transparency or using percentages of color can really be an effective strategy for adding more information in, but keeping your design less chaotic and more kind of relaxing and letting people kind of look at it without feeling crazy because there's so much going on in the image. So this is a good example of how color can help define and separate items of copy. And it also can give kind of added visual meaning to the image and the copy. So up here, this is called ghosting, actually. When you put something underneath, actually this part is actually literally ghosting, where you're putting something underneath the text that's kind of transparent or semi-transparent with some information underneath it. That's pulling the text off of the image a little bit, because if you just place text on a busy image, it's quickly going to feel really chaotic and you're not going to be able to read the text very well. So you want to kind of strategize, especially with poster design. You sometimes have this text that you have to have stay legible, but you want to have this beautiful image. So sometimes just creating these borders for yourself, creating these boxes where you can just lay the text on top, and keeping the colors kind of harmonious with whatever colors you're using in the image can be good strategy. And we know that color emphasizes. So you can see this beautiful fish and then this tiny bit of text. And they're using transparency and kind of saturation here with this graphic. They're kind of letting it kind of fade into that background. So thinking about that, and how do you make the eye kind of move around the space? That's really critical with poster design. You want to wow somebody, you want to capture attention, but then you want them to also read specific elements. This is an album, Blue Note Sound, and it's Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers and the Horace Silver Quintet. And you can see this is beautifully done because it's once again a good strategy. What they've done is they've taken this interesting photo and they've desaturated it, turned it into a grayscale photo, and then they've tinted it with a color, and then they've applied white text just around the border where the photo isn't so busy. So really good strategy. You're getting that energy, but you're also, the text has a place, feeling really balanced, beautifully done, and it's keeping kind of that quality of the music. What is this music about? You can almost kind of get a sense of what you're going to hear with this design. So I'm going to go through these different color palettes. This is a design for the Yale Repertory Theater, and they were presenting Tree. And these are 4 different color schemes that I'm going to show you. So this color scheme, is really different than this color scheme. But this is something I want you to really do with your poster design. I want you to experiment and try different things. Like you did with your logo, you're really going to experiment and see what mood you get by changing the color scheme really dramatically. So you can see here, this is kind of a collection of warm and cool grays. It feels more urban. These hues connect well with kind of the streetwise aspect of the performance. There's also areas of highly inviting kind of saturated color that kind of pop out. And the result is kind of a restrained but funky, edgy yet warm. It has energy and contrast. And this palette might be designed to attract kind of a modern urbanite. Now this, let's label this one natural, and this does not kind of create the same energy as seen in the previous color scheme. The feeling's much more restrained. It's kind of more of an organic feel. There's actually only 5 colors used here, and the value contrast between the hues is pretty minimal. The photos are tinted with kind of a beige tone, and they're removing the white from the palette, and it's kind of this subtle, vibrating feeling, and it feels very down to earth. This is more of a soft touch. If you're going to label this one, it could be soft touch, and it's mostly warm pastel tones, which kind of paint the dance performance in a softer light. If the goal of this poster was to attract the attention of kind of a more sensitive, less hyperactive audience, then this scheme might work. The pale hues kind of dominate this design, but there's some potency here through the use of bright colors in the lower portion of the layout. And in this sample, unlike some of the others, the tree's background kind of merges seamlessly with the border, and it minimizes the border's effect and promotes a more kind of quiet sense of unity. This might be titled World Beat. This is actually really kind of getting to the music aspect and the cross-cultural aspect, much darker than the original. It highlights kind of the cultural relevance of the dance performance. And this color scheme was kind of based on these deeply saturated dyes and pigments used by cultures around the world. And all is kind of intensified by the black border. And so you have to think about this as a designer, which color scheme is appropriate. Now, maybe your client is going to decide that for you, but you want to experiment, compare and contrast, see what works. Don't just settle on the first color scheme that you kind of brainstorm. Always kind of going back to looking, comparing, contrasting, like we did with our logo assignment.